God has such great stuff in store for us, but we don't often see it because our perspective is totally foreign to the perspective of faith. And we're going to talk about faith this morning, probably the greatest act of faith in the Old Testament. Abraham pulls off a great feat. Verse 23 in this chapter has often been thought by some to be the greatest feat of courage. One preacher said he could preach on anything in the Bible and find what God was saying through it, and somebody pointed to verse 23 of chapter 22 here. In the King James it says, 8 sons did milk a bear, and he read that and said, well, I see courage there. It takes courage to milk a bear, no matter how many sons there are trying to do it. So the King James is a little confusing. It's a little better here, but that's not the greatest feat. The greatest feat in this chapter is where Abraham obeys what God asks him to do. Abraham is probably a teenager at this time, the teenager the second time around. He's probably 113, 114, somewhere around there. And he's got a teenager in Isaac now. Isaac is old enough now to travel with him, to carry burdens with him. So Isaac is probably at the teenager age, just the age where possibly 12 there was a changing into manhood in their understanding. And possibly Isaac was right at that time where Abraham, recognizing that this was the promised child, was beginning to expect God to start doing things in the life of Isaac. And God does do something. God tells Abraham to take his son and to sacrifice him as a burnt offering. And Abraham is hit with a tremendous dilemma. Abraham entered the school of faith at age 75. And for about 40 years now, he has been in this school. And God has been giving him test after test after test. You would think 40 years in school would be enough. We go to school, if you go through high school, you go about 12 years through there, or 13 years if you count kindergarten. If you go on, you got 17 if you count college. Some people go on beyond that. But there comes a time it seems like school should be over. We shouldn't have to go to school anymore. The tennis coach out in Arizona tried to get my mom to go back to school on a tennis scholarship because she kept beating, she's 60 years old, she kept beating all the college girls from his college. So he tried to talk her into going back to school, but she didn't want to go back to school even if she could play tennis while she did it. But the school of faith never, ever ends. A 75-year-old man entered into it in a deeper way as God called him out of Ur of Chaldees. And now he's 110 or better, and he's still learning lessons. In fact, the lessons are getting deeper and deeper. A 6th grader who had just gone into Yoakum this year, I was sitting by him and talking to him at some basketball tryouts this week, and he said, boy, Katie's not going to like Yoakum, and Josh is not going to like Yoakum because they give tests on everything here. They give more tests, and every year you get more and more tests. That's the way school is. When you go to school, they don't test you in 8th grade what 1 + 1 + 1 is. They may do that in 1st grade or 2nd grade, but the tests get harder, the tests get more. Maybe in 3rd grade they say write a paragraph. In 8th grade they say write 3 pages. In high school they say write 10 pages. In college they say write 20 pages. It just gets more and more and more. And as we look at Abraham's life, we can see that the tests become greater and greater, and yet the curriculum doesn't change. The curriculum stays the same. In every test that Abraham had, he had one curriculum at a different level of learning. And that curriculum was obedient faith, not over-obedient. Obedient faith overcomes the trials of life. Obedient faith overcomes the trials of life. That was 101, 201, 301, 401, all the classes he took to a higher level, a higher level, and a higher level. Obedient faith overcomes the trials of life. In 1 John chapter 5, it says, this is the victory that has overcome the world, our faith. As Abraham learned to walk by faith, he would learn the true power of God available in his life. We are never too old to face new challenges, to fight new battles, and to learn new truth. When we stop learning, we stop growing. When we stop growing, we stop living. And if you are not growing in the Christian life, you are not living the Christian life at all. God was not going to let Abraham retire from obedient faith. God just continued to build upon the last challenge and the last challenge and the challenge before that. 4 things I want to share with you this morning. Number 1 is this. Tests are a part of God's curriculum. Tests should be the norm. You should be having tests in your life. More and more tests. Verse 1 says, sometime later God tested Abraham. And Abraham said, God, find somebody else. I've had enough. Abraham said, here I am. Like he expected it, just waiting for the next time around. Here I am, Lord, I'm ready for another test, or bring the next test on. Abraham had had test after test. When he was 75 years old, he had the family test. And that was a test whether he'd be willing to leave the Ur of Chaldees and move to Canaan, to separate himself. He passed that test because he was willing to do it. Then he had the famine test. He got to the Ur of Chaldees, or he got to Canaan from the Ur of Chaldees, and there was a famine going on. He had to decide whether he was going to trust God in the famine or go find some place like the Ur where he could sustain himself, he thought, without God around. And so he failed that test and went to Egypt. Then he had the fellowship test. He came back, and him and Lot couldn't live together. The land couldn't sustain them. And the fellowship test he passed because he gave Lot the option. And then God took care of him as he surrendered his own rights. Then he had a fight test when Lot got in trouble and he was taken away with other captives, and he passed that test as he trusted God as an old man, probably riding a camel or a donkey and chasing after armies with his own servants and winning that battle and bringing back the captives. Then he had a fortune test. After he brought back all the captives, he was approached by the king of Sodom, the king of Salem, Melchizedek. He had to make a choice whether he's going to make an alliance with the king of Sodom by keeping the booty, or whether he's going to give it all back and just let God be his only resource. He passed that test because he gave it all back and said, let no one else but God be the one that provides for my life. Then he had a fatherhood test in chapter 16, which he failed. His wife brought a handmaiden to him named Hagar and said, I can't have children. Have a child of the promise with Hagar. And he agreed to do that, and Ishmael was born. He failed that test. And then he failed again. He went again down to where Abimelech was. Made a second mistake in that he lied about his relationship with Sarah, saying that she was his sister. Got her in peril again, and he failed the test of the intimidation that would come by being a foreigner in a strange land. And finally, we come to the greatest test of all, and that is Isaac, the promised child, has grown up. The promises he's thinking are going to be soon realized. And then God comes to him and tells him to offer that child, to offer Isaac as a burnt offering. Now, where do trials and tests come in our life? Some of them come because our own disobedience invites difficulties into our life. God doesn't design those for our lives, but our own disobedience kind of builds them in there. We go into a marriage with the wrong principles and wrong behavior ourselves, and the marriage falls apart. We wonder, why did God do that to me? Or we live with the wrong financial principles, and finances become a problem. The credit cards get way over our heads, and we have all these problems, and we can't blame those on God. So not everything is from God. Some things also come out of normal human experience. We experience pain and difficulty in this life because this life, there's death in this life, there's struggles in this life. A man is to gain and provide by the sweat of his brow, so there's just natural difficulties. There's also a difference between trials and temptations in this life. The devil comes from the inside and tries to bring temptations against us by tempting our inner desires and the lusts that are in there. God comes from the outside and tries to bring and allows trials in our life. Temptations come to bring out our worst. Trials come to bring out our best. Temptations often make a lot of sense. They seem real logical. Why not do that? And often the trials seem very unreasonable. You know, why should I restrict myself like that? Why should God ask that of me? So often the rationale is to go with the temptation rather than the trial. Why should I take this child that you promised to me and do what you just asked me to do, God? That is not logical. Many of God's trials come into our life, and they are not logical at all. God said, take your son, your only son, Isaac. Didn't say Ishmael. If he would have said Isaac, he might have said, okay, where's Ishmael at? Well, we'll obey God. Whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I will tell you about. Now, we are so familiar with that, we don't think about how that must have struck Abraham. To hear God say that, he must have thought, what are you talking about? I must not have heard you right. That is the craziest thing that I've ever heard. But God knew that Abraham was ready to hear something that crazy. Temptations are very common. The Bible talks about them being common to each one of us. And that God has given us the sufficiency to be victorious against temptation. But trials are often very unique. God could not have come to Lot and asked this of Lot. Lot was not at the spiritual place in life anywhere near where Abraham was. God could ask this of Abraham. Trials are often a compliment that God believes the best of us, that God is ready to promote us to another level. Some people don't get trials because they're not ready for trials. God can't take them to a level higher because they are living at such a level where Lot is that God just can't use them. Lot, you hear some things Lot might have said. Me teach a class? No way. I could never teach a class. Tithe? That's the craziest thing I've ever heard of. Those are things that Lot would say. Ministry, going to the ministry, there is no way. I could never do that. Give my testimony down at the rescue mission. It's just not in me to do those kinds of things. Could never ask anything unreasonable of Lot. Unreasonable in the sense that in the flesh he couldn't do it. Abraham could do what God asked him. As difficult as it was, Abraham could do it, but only by God's power. So expect tests to be part of God's curriculum if you are on the right road and are moving on, graduating and promoting with each test. The second thing is promises should be our primary focus. Tests are part of God's curriculum, but promises should be our primary focus. It says in verse 3 through 5, early the next morning, Abraham got up, he saddled his donkey, he took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood and for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up, saw the place in a distance, and he said to his servants, stay here with the donkey. While I and the boy go up there, we will worship, and we will come back. The very next morning, Abraham got busy. He didn't spend weeks trying to figure out if God was really meaning what God was saying. This made so little sense that we would be tempted to just wait around until God gave us a little more of a clue in on this so we'd feel more comfortable with it. But Abraham did not wait for that at all. He immediately got to work obeying God. And the best way to fight doubt is to find out what God has said and just start doing it. And expect God to fill in the pieces to make things more understandable as you go along obeying Him. And Abraham immediately started putting together all that God had asked of him. Warren Wiersbe said this. He said, our faith is not really tested until God asks us to bear what seems unbearable, to do what seems unreasonable, and to expect what seems impossible. Abraham did all this work, then he traveled for 3 days. And I know that in his mind was, how is God going to pull this off? God has promised that this would be. God has said, in Isaac shall your seed be blessed. In Isaac is the one. God had put him by name. And Abraham wasn't like George Foreman. George Foreman named all his sons, 5 sons, George the first, George the second, George the third. He couldn't just say, okay, we'll get another Isaac here. He wasn't like that. God had definitely said, this is the promised child. For 3 days, Abraham had to make his way, cut that wood, saddle, get the servants together, make all the necessary preparations, and make that journey, arrive at that mountain, and in his mind, he had to somehow identify how God could work by saying one thing and seemingly saying the very opposite, and that in this paradox it would all come together and work. Hebrews chapter 11 says that Abraham, and in his mind, had thought that God was able to raise the dead. And so after his son was offered as a burnt offering, that God would just raise him back up. That was the best explanation that Abraham could come up with after the 3 days of this rioting and preparation. So when he walked up that mountain, that's the only solution that he saw for God having. Now, as we look at this, I want you to consider a few things here. Consider Abraham's descendants, those who followed after him. They got in unreasonable situations as well. If you can imagine Joseph sitting in a prison cell and marking off day after day, year after year for 13 years after having those dreams. The dream said one thing, and yet the prison cell said another. You can imagine Moses taking all this million people out of Egypt, and then God leading him right up against the Red Sea. And then here comes Pharaoh and his army. A moment of wondering, what in the world is God pulling off here? If you can imagine Daniel counting lions. Daniel was obeying God, and all of a sudden here he is with lions surrounding him. The descendants that Abraham would have would certainly be encouraged by the faith. Every one of them seemed to be taking on what was unbearable, dealing with what was unreasonable, and struggling with what seemed to be impossible from the human vantage point. And yet God was in every one of those situations, and God was bringing through those irrational moments glory to himself. Consider God's request. The child of the covenant, a child of a miracle, a child who had been promised all the way from the beginning when he had left earth. A loved son, one they just treasured, one in whom the whole future rested upon. God said he should be offered as a burnt offering. Raised him to a teenager. And then God comes along and says that he is not the one. In a sense, as far as Abraham could figure out, God was going to take him off the scene. And Abraham just couldn't see how that would work, one with the other. We need to learn that God's will never contradict God's promises. Whether we can understand it or not, God's will never contradict God's promises. God doesn't give us all the explanation, but he does give us enough to know the next step we need to take. God was saying, in Isaac shall your seed be blessed, shall your seed be called. Let me give you a third one this morning. Not only are tests part of God's curriculum, but promises are to be our focus. Abraham was focusing on that promise rather than the paradox that he had. But also, provisions are God's part. It was God's responsibility to provide for the need of this situation. Abraham tried the best he could to figure it out, but it was God's responsibility to pull this thing off. In verse 6 it says, Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. And the two of them went on together, and Isaac spoke up and said to his father, something he'd been thinking, Father, the fire and the wood are here. Where's the lamb for the burnt offering? How would you like to be a father? Ask that question. Dad, I see everything here but the offering. Where's the offering at, Dad? And Abraham had to try to figure out what to say. Abraham had done his part. He had the wood. He had made the journey. He had the fire for the offering. He had brought his son there. And all he could say to Isaac was, God will provide for himself a sacrifice. And sometimes as parents, our kids come to us with questions that we don't have all the answers. The only answer we can give them is, God's in charge. God's going to take care of this situation. I can't explain to you how the next days or the next weeks or the next months are going to fall in place. But right now we're going to take the principles of God and obey them, and God is going to take care of what we can't understand or foresee from the vantage point that we're at right now. Abraham could only depend on the faithfulness of God, that God would obey his promises. He couldn't trust his feelings. I'm sure his feelings were tearing him apart inside as he contemplated whether God would raise Isaac or not. Just the very act of having to slay Isaac Must have been torturing him. He couldn't count on anybody else. He left the servants down there. He left Sarah back in the camp. He couldn't really explain it all to Isaac. He was alone in the sense in himself. It said they reached the place where God had told him about. Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac. He laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. He had come all the way to the very end. If you can imagine this moment, the heart of Abraham inside just tearing apart, and maybe Isaac and the fear in his eyes as he's laying there and really realizing what's going on right now, and their eyes connecting at that moment, doesn't say any words are really said. As Isaac recognizes what's going on now. Imagine God just waiting out those moments of emotion from both sides. God allowing this thing to go all the way to its very end. And if you can imagine those words from that angel impacting that 110, 12, 13-year-old man's ears and saying, Abraham, Abraham, with that familiar sound. He knew the voice, the same voice that told him to take his son, I'm sure. Now screamed out again his name. Said, Abraham, Abraham, don't lay your hands on the boy. It says, don't do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. God was there at exactly the right time because God saw in Abraham all he wanted to see in that test. That test met its purpose at that moment. We see four things that happened when God's provision finally got there. Number one is it came in the right place, in the place of obedience. We have no right to expect God's provision to come to us if we're not in the will of God. We have no right to expect God to bless our plans, to bless our agenda. He's not obligated to do that. He's obligated to bless His work in our life. God said, now I know you fear the Lord. And you may sit here today and say, I fear God. But He said, I know you fear the Lord because you've not withheld from me. And you may look at yourself and really look at yourself and saying, am I withholding from God? Am I withholding time? Am I withholding my talents, my willingness to serve? Am I withholding my treasure? Am I withholding from God my obedience? God knows you fear Him when you are not withholding from Him. It doesn't matter how much you may bring to Him in trying to balance some scales. If there are things in your life you are withholding. The rich young ruler came to Jesus and said, well, I've done this, I've done this, I've done this. And Jesus said, well, go do this. And he would not do it. He withheld that obedience to Christ. You really fear God when you are no longer withholding what God is asking, no matter how much of what He's not asking for that you're trying to give Him. The second thing is that God's provision came in the time of need. Hebrews chapter 4 tells us to draw near to God that we might receive grace in the time of need. What seemed to be the last minute was only really the perfect moment, when God's test had accomplished all that God wanted to accomplish. It had met its purpose. God is never late. He's always right there where His clock says it's time. But often our lack of faith or our anxiousness, our emotion wants Him to come much sooner, but coming much sooner would not accomplish the purpose that God wants. And the third thing is that God's provision came in a natural manner. God did not open up the heavens and drop down a lamb through the heavens. God just allowed a lamb to get its horns caught in the thicket. And whether it was there at the first and Abraham just didn't see it, or whether it just at the moment of need it got caught and started bellowing, and Abraham saw it at that time. But it came in a very normal and natural way, but the miracle was the timing. The miracle was the events that surrounded it that made it the perfect answer to that moment. And a fourth thing, it came to glorify, God's provision came to glorify His name. Often when we have problems and God puts burdens upon us, He increases our needs, we start to focus on ourselves. When God is trying to get us to be a channel so that at the proper time we can receive and give glory to Himself. Often we start saying, "Not me, Lord," and then when it comes we say, "Why me, Lord?" Instead of saying something like, "How can I honor Jesus Christ in this moment and with this trial?" We have the whole wrong attitude. The trials that we go through in life are meant to lift up Jesus Christ. And when we start focusing on how bad we've got it, how mean God is to us, why is God asking this of me, we take the focus totally off of where God is trying to bring us in this process, to bring glory to Himself. There's a little bracelet that goes around, "What would Jesus do?" WWJD. And Jesus was put under the severest trial. We can maybe change that to WDJD. What did Jesus do when He was taken to Calvary? We can see that He prayed for His enemies in the most difficult moments. He forgave those who did things to Him that were much worse than what we've ever had done to us. He spoke with God and He trusted God. He obeyed to the point of death and He gained the victory. When God asks the unreasonable, in God's timing, God brings something so much more magnificent into our lives when we allow Him to. Let me give you a fourth thing, and that is the future is God's perfected end. God's goal is to get us to point perfect. And the more we're willing to go through the school of faith, the more we're willing to trust God and let Him bring us from level to level to level, the more He works into us the image and reflection of Jesus Christ. He is trying to get us from right here where He found us to right there where His Son is. And He's not punishing us. He is trying to use that which will put the most pressure into our lives to bring the most growth into our lives so that we can get closer and closer to that image, that the world can see that reflection coming from our lives. There is always an afterwards to God's test. That afterwards is always what is said in Job. It says this in Job. It says, "But He knoweth the way that I take. When He hath tested me, I shall come forth as gold." After this test of Abraham had some brand new things in his life. His relationship with God was changed. It was renewed. We see here that God says, "I swear by myself that because you have done this and have not withheld your Son, your only Son, I will surely bless you, make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all the nations of the earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me." He had a brand new relationship with God. And when we obey God, we get more and more closer to that moment where God can say, "Well done, thy good and faithful servant. You simply obeyed what I asked." He didn't try to figure it out to make it logical. He just obeyed. It was unbearable. It was unreasonable. It seemed impossible, but you trusted me in it, and I was faithful through it. You brought glory to my name. Now you're on the other side, a different, stronger person. I can see him coming down from that mountain with a spring in his step as those servants began to spy him coming down, just excited, probably like that the father of the prodigal son when he first saw just that emotion flooding him as he moved on with God from there. His relationship with God was renewed, but also his relationship with Isaac was renewed. Isaac had seen his dad bowing and worshiping at altars and things. But now Isaac saw the deeper side of his father's faith. Isaac saw more than just the words. And Isaac participated in his father's act of faith. Isaac came down different. They had something together with God now that was different. Isaac would be different from this moment on because of his father's faithfulness and willing to obey God. In Hudson Taylor's house, there was a plaque, and that plaque was this. It said, Jehovah Jireh. Jehovah Jireh means the Lord will provide. It also means the Lord will be seen. It has all these different ways that you can interpret it. And that is what Abraham named this place where the ram was provided, when the night was stopped. Jehovah Jireh. The Lord will provide. The Lord will be seen. And you may ask yourself this morning, when people look at your life, do people see God there? Do they see His fingerprints on your life as being a provider for you? Are you more like Abraham, whom God can trust with more and more tests? Or are you more like Lot? You may be sitting here this morning and think that you're blessed because nothing seems to disrupt your life. And yet the very opposite is true. God often brings in His disruptions the growth that takes us to the next level. The sad truth is that God can probably not entrust a test to you. Because of that, you never promote, you never graduate, you're stuck at the same old spiritual age for the next 20 years. You are the Jethro Bodine of the spiritual world. You're in 6th grade forever and ever and ever, and you're going to hit heaven at that same level. When God wanted to have you all the way through graduate school by now, growing and going for God in the spiritual world. For many of us, it's time to grow up, to go on with God. The world is not worth the distraction that it brings to our lives. It is not worth the cost that it brings to us. Abraham passed this test with an A+. It finishes and says, Then Abraham returned to his servants, and they set off together. He left Moriah, a totally different man. And a simple decision in your life of obedience may cause you to leave this church this morning, leave this day,